Thank you very much for having me today. I would just like to premise, I'm mostly a humanitarianism scholar, let's say conflict humanitarianism scholar. So when I was living in Istanbul 2 years back, I instead realized how important disaster was. Like it was pretty much in everyday conversations, way before the February 2023 earthquake, of course. So that's when I realized that I really needed to delve a little bit more into the intercross between conflict and disaster, something that contemporary scholarship doesn't do much, or at least not yet. But we are on the right track, especially after last year's earthquake. So that's exactly where these research is kind of located. The research is on disaster knowledge and housing choices of migrants and refugees, mostly from an Arabic and Persian-speaking background. Of course, there are migrants and refugees even from other heritages in Istanbul, especially in the southern western districts that we focused on, just for the sake of clarity, for those of you who know Istanbul well. Pretty much all the neighborhoods between Fatih and Esenyurt. And in all of these neighborhoods, there are different levels of risk, vis-a-vis earthquakes in particular and landslide. So this is not a solo authored paper that will come up soon in the research Oxford Encyclopedia of Natural Science Hazard. But I've been working on this with Professor Cassidy Johnson at University College London, and my colleague Saman Ghaffarian, also based with me in the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction at UCL, and Wais Hummus. There is an architect based in Istanbul, so that's we had a geoscience, architecture, social anthropology perspective in all of these, which is interesting. This is not strictly related to the research that, of course, I will soon share with you right now, but I really wanted you to get familiar with the commonalities and dissimilarities across the field of conflict and disaster that eventually led me to this idea of investigating disaster knowledge in Istanbul. So, and I'm particularly going to focus on social membership, so the sense of belonging, the sense of feeling a member of a particular segment, of the host society, especially for migrants and refugees, is something that has been looked at differently in the field of studies focused on conflict and the one on disaster. For instance, in the case of conflict response, we have a weird compartmentalization of the literature on local, internally displaced people and refugees, as though the latter belong to a different affected society or something. Instead, in the case of disaster, it was quite rare to focus on migrants and refugees. Actually, before the February 2023 earthquake, we already have a large number of papers now, even in the grey literature, not just in academia, focusing on migrants and refugees in a country like Turkey and elsewhere. Of course, I'm not saying it's something totally new in the sense that the Sendai framework already kind of affirmed that it was quite important to understand the peculiarities of migrant and refugees group in affected societies, in disaster-affected societies. But in the case of Turkey, if you give a look at the literature, it's particularly after the last earthquake that you finally have a little bit of incorporation of the refugee reality into what happens during disaster. And this is mostly due to the large number of Syrians coming after conflict started in 2011 in Syria. And therefore, of course, it's an unprecedented number of refugees and migrants in these specific regions hit by the earthquake in Turkey. So, of course, it's also linked up with the refugee history of the country. Then, while in conflict, we've got methodological nationalism. That means studying conflict and humanitarian services to groups whose needs are understood on the basis of nationality. Instead, like in the case of disaster, like the thing is quite different, because we've mostly adopted a holistic approach to the disaster-affected society, while neglecting group peculiarities, cultural, economic, political specificities of these different social groups, like refugee and migrants as well. And while in the case of conflict, we've got like what we call localization of aid, like as institutionalized in 2015 with the Sustainable Development Goals. We've got a similar discourse in the literature on disaster when we talk about the need of localizing, contextualizing disaster preparedness. That means becoming more responsive to group specificities, to understanding like what sort of society we are dealing with as people that focus on disaster response. So getting deeper into the research that I'm gonna present today, this is our upcoming paper. Like here, like we mostly focused on particular neighborhoods. So the one, let's say, with lower risk, like in a lower propensity to disaster relatively, of course, like was both Fatih and the Senior, and then different levels of risk in Beylikdüzü, Avcılar, Küçükçekmece, Büyükçekmece, and like all the other ones, and Bağcılar as well. That's what we looked at more specifically. So our key research questions were about disaster knowledge. One could say like, well, it's something that I can figure out. Actually, sociologically speaking, it's not to taken for granted, because again, these mitigation risk programs and the training and educational programs run by municipalities in Turkey are not group responsive yet, are not like really informed by these group specificities. So what you have in place, the so-called afet bilinci eğitimleri, right? Like, so it's like these educational programs are just like, let's say, focused on the technical know-how of people, how they need to respond to that, but they are not culturally informed by social differences. So that's why we're not talking of mere preparedness here. We're talking of disaster knowledge, which is way broader. And then the factors that we consider here to understand and investigate housing choices across the different groups, of course, were the role of kinship and human networks in a particular place. Some of these groups, like are migrant, but are long-standing in the Istanbul social fabric. It's the case of Afghans, Iranians, but even from our Arabic-speaking backgrounds, like Iraqis, the Iraqi crisis, that is way more long-standing than the Syria one, so not just reducing the whole discourse like to Syrians. That is what has been looked at primarily in the literature. Also, we consider their both international and local migratory trajectories before choosing a particular house, or not necessarily choosing it. And their legal status as well. It's something that we didn't particularly ask. We wanted people to feel comfortable while responding, also because this project was designed 5 months before last year's earthquake, but we conducted the interviews starting 2 months after the earthquake. So it was particularly sensitive posing this question. And some of them didn't own a legal status, and of course were like kind of freaking out sometimes, like having to respond to political questions, also considering that this was coming before the elections. So it was particularly challenging, and of course participation happened merely on a exclusively on a voluntary basis. And then of course we consider how this disaster knowledge varies across the districts, but also across the groups. Afghans were more disadvantaged. They seemed to have, let's say, a lower command of the Turkish language, unlike Arabic-speaking migrants and refugees. And also because most of them actually arrived quite late. Not all of them, but most of the Afghans that we talked to actually arrived in Turkey after the return to power of the Taliban in 2021. So they were pretty new, and they did recognize that they didn't know much about disaster in Turkey before the February earthquake. And other groups, again, like Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, Palestine, Sudan, and Iraq. Especially Syrians, the case of Syrians that we interviewed was a little bit more, let's say, privileged, like without emphasizing too much the word, because it's like they managed to get Turkish citizenship, and therefore they managed to become homeowners in some cases. So we also asked about year of arrival in Turkey in general, in that current district of Istanbul, and in the current house. So methodologies, Saman Ghaffarian took care of the, like through remote sensing, of an assessment of land use throughout the district from 2010. So this historical watershed is quite important for the so-called Arab world, because it's when in December from Tunisia, you start dealing with what we call the Arab Spring. So many protests against the local governments that eventually produced large flows of forced migration towards Turkey as well. Then a review of construction, building materials conducted by Cassidy Johnson, and Isa Homos and myself instead developed the sociological understanding of how the idea of a future disaster is developed, like the way it's configured, vis-a-vis housing choices in these groups. So 71 interviewed people, and of course, we didn't conduct an ethnography with each of these national groups. That's why we try to identify a collective understanding of disaster knowledge and housing choices for each group. But it was not, of course, something that was particularly based on their nationality. Here you need another type of time frame and another type of methodology. So here just to share a little bit of what people say about this. The accounts we collected kind of vary from a destiny discourse. People saying, especially Syrians in this case, the earthquake will destroy everything, so we might be anywhere in Istanbul during the event. So not overlooking the thing, but kind of suggesting that there is no specialistic knowledge in that sense, that many of them really wanted to claim, really wanted to develop specialistic knowledge instead on disaster in the place where they were living. Others saying we are in the hands of God, not much can be done. And also some economic and social determinism for some people that were positioned as refugees. So it's a position of legal, political vulnerability in Turkey. Some saying, I would have no other place to go anyway. That does reflect what another one say. We are only refugees. Worrying about earthquakes is a local thing, which is quite telling about the intersectional nature of vulnerability here, and how much instead can be done to make their housing way safer, from a technical perspective. So just to sum up a little bit the research funding, as I mentioned, most of them do not own the house, right, because only 3 out of 71 managed to get Turkish citizenship. Some Syrians had instead temporary protection, but you're still a little bit better placed to decide where to move, of course, although the legal status not necessarily was an advantage for them. But yeah, only 9% own the flat. Then in general, let's say the vast majority, 55%, affirmed that their building was probably not earthquake proof, none of them access documentation. Even the 3 house owners I mentioned, like they were like, you know what? I mean, I'm not sure. I'm actually not sure. I'm basing my judgment on the number of years of the building, but this thing of the documentation is a little bit up in the air. And disaster, in terms of disaster knowledge, all of them, 90%, did have satisfactory knowledge, even knew about the 99 Marmara earthquake and so on, and that Turkey is relatively equipped for these sort of things. But not specialistic knowledge. That's what they were really claiming, and that's what I would like to work on in the next few years. Then the idea of the future earthquake overall, of course, was impacting people's psychology, but it couldn't be a factor for their housing choices because of some reasons. First of all, legal status, again, that emerged as very important to make choices. Then, even if you have a legal status, you've got a migrant or refugee background. So still, like they were mentioning, here they say no one wants to rent to Syrians or sell the house to Syrians, so you need to deal with the stereotype there. And some of them were like, no matter how unsafe this place is, by now I've got long-standing community ties here, and that's the place where I work. So in general, some broad sociological considerations here to wrap up, like it's important to incorporate refugee-led, migrant-led networks as well of solidarity and the group peculiarities into disaster knowledge. So not just talking about preparedness from the perspective of technical know-how. And then we do need to uphold this holistic approach that we've always had to the disaster-affected society. No one is advocating for methodological nationalism in that sense, but you still need to inform such holistic approach with group specificities. And again, this is extremely recent in the case of Turkey. So that's why it's fundamental to start reasoning across disaster and conflict. So yeah, thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer.